on what was meant to be the happiest day of his life. Firefighter Michael Hayes stood at the altar, waiting for his bride. But before the vows could be spoken, his loyal German shepherd, once a proud K9, leapt forward and tore through her gown. Gasps filled the garden as guests froze, and beneath the shredded lace, something hidden was revealed. Something no one expected at a wedding. That single moment shattered everything, turning celebration into chaos and leaving Michael facing a truth far darker than heartbreak. What secret did the dog uncover that day? Watch the full story unfold. The afternoon sun washed over the estate in a warm golden glow, as if heaven itself had leaned closer to bless this day. Rows of white chairs lined the garden aisle. Guests dressed in their finest waited in hushed expectation, and violins played softly in the background. All eyes turned toward the entrance, where Emily Carter appeared radiant in her white gown that shimmered with delicate lace. Each step she took down the stone path felt rehearsed by fate, graceful, steady. Carrying the weight of countless dreams she had once whispered to her closest friends about how her wedding day would look. She held a bouquet of lilies close to her chest, her lips curved into the careful smile of a woman who wanted the world to see her happiness. At the altar stood Michael Hayes, a decorated firefighter, known throughout his community as a man of courage, a man who ran into flames when others ran away. But at this moment, his heart was not the steady flame of duty. It was a storm of nerves pounding in his chest as his eyes locked onto Emily's. His palms felt damp despite the cool breeze threading through the tall oaks around the estate. He smiled wide and earnest, trying to soak in the moment before the vows, before the promises, before the life they were about to begin together. Then the world shifted in a single heartbeat. From the side of the aisle, 3 figures burst into the scene with a force that shattered the carefully orchestrated silence. Ranger, the old German shepherd who had once worn the proud harness of a K9 unit, lunged forward with surprising speed for his age. His amber eyes glowed with intensity, his body moving not as a pet crashing a wedding, but as a soldier stepping into a battlefield. He leapt directly toward the hem of Emily's gown, his teeth tearing through fabric with a sound that sliced the air sharper than the violins ever could. The lace ripped apart, fluttering in the air like fragile snowflakes, and gasps erupted from the crowd. Before anyone could react, Shadow, the sleek Belgian Malinois, darted across the aisle. His movements were swift, calculated, his muscles coiled with precision as he planted himself directly in Emily's path. His body lowered slightly, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on her every movement. He was not attacking, but he was blocking a living wall between her and the altar. The atmosphere changed instantly, tension thick as thunderclouds gathering above a summer field. And then came Scout. The black Labrador, gentle by nature but fiercely protective, when the moment demanded, surged forward to stand between the guests and the chaos at the center of the aisle. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his throat rumbling with a deep growl that rolled through the garden like distant thunder. Guests who had begun to rise from their seats to intervene froze their hands, half extended in shock. Scout's growl was not savage, but it carried a warning clear enough that no one dared to take another step closer. His body was planted firm, tail-stiff eyes, scanning the crowd as though daring anyone to try and stop what was unfolding. The scene descended into pure confusion. Women screamed. Men shouted. The violinists dropped their bows. Mid-note, and the officiant stood frozen, with his book open, words caught in his throat. The bride's mother clutched her chest, her face blanching with fear and outrage as she tried to push forward only to be halted by Scout's stance. Guests exchanged frantic whispers. What were the dogs doing? Why were they here? Why now, on this day of all days? Emily's cry pierced through the noise high and sharp as she tried to gather the torn fabric of her dress with trembling hands. Her cheeks flushed red with a mixture of humiliation and fury. Michael, she shouted, her voice breaking, desperate for him to do something, anything to stop this madness. But Michael stood rooted to the spot. His body was tense, his eyes wide, yet beneath the shock, there was something else flickering in his gaze, something that made him hesitate before rushing forward. Ranger was not a dog who acted without reason. Michael had trusted him with his life more times than he could count. He knew the weight behind those instincts, knew that when Ranger made a move, it was because he had seen, smelled, or sensed something hidden from human eyes. Shadow and Scout had followed their coordination too precise to be mere chaos. It felt like the three dogs were united in a single mission. The shouts grew louder, aunts and uncles rising in outrage, children crying in confusion, and friends covering their mouths in disbelief. The once dreamlike garden had transformed into a battlefield of emotions, each corner filled with anger, fear, and shock. Michael's father stepped from the front row, his voice booming as he demanded, "Someone get the animals under control." But even his command was swallowed by the chaos as Scout's growl deepened, echoing with authority that made even the boldest guests falter. Emily tried to step back away from Ranger's grip on her gown, but Shadow's body shifted, cutting her off with unnerving precision. His eyes followed her every twitch, his chest rising with steady breaths, signaling that he was ready to act again if she made the wrong move. It was not the picture of a dog gone wild. It was the picture of a guardian who had chosen his target. Ranger tore away another layer of lace fabric, scattering across the grass, while his eyes never left the area around Emily's waist. His teeth clamped down with determination, as though he wasn't simply destroying a dress, but exposing something that needed to be revealed. His growl was low, deliberate, vibrating in Michael's chest, even from several feet away. The sound was familiar, haunting. It was the same growl Ranger had used in burning buildings when he had discovered hidden survivors, or in dark alleys when danger was near. It was a sound Michael could never mistake. Emily's tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking her makeup as she tried to shove Ranger away. Her bouquet fell to the ground, petals scattering across the aisle like shattered hopes. She screamed again for someone to help, her voice climbing in pitched desperation, dripping from every word. Her bridesmaids rushed forward instinctively, but Scout barked once, loud and commanding, stopping them in their tracks. His black coat bristled under the sunlight, his eyes burning with loyalty to the mission. Only he and the other two dogs seemed to understand. The officiant finally found his voice, stammering, "We need to someone, please." But his words dissolved as no one dared to cross the invisible line Scout had drawn. The garden, once filled with sweet music and the fragrance of flowers, now smelled of fear and confusion. Guests clutched their pearls, their ties, their children whispering accusations, mad dogs, poorly trained animals, or something darker. Each theory spread like wildfire in the tense air. Michael's chest tightened with each passing second. He could feel the weight of every eye pressing against him, waiting for him to act, to call his dogs back to take control of the situation. Yet his legs refused to move. His heart hammered not only from the embarrassment of the scene, but from the gnawing truth he couldn't push away. These three had never failed him before. Every scar on his body, every breath he still drew, was a reminder that they had always acted with purpose. And here they were, united, fierce, unstoppable against the woman he was moments away from marrying. The fabric of Emily's gown gave way under Ranger's relentless grip, tearing open enough to reveal something dark beneath the white layers. Something that made Michael's breath catch in his throat. He blinked, leaning forward slightly, unsure if his eyes were betraying him, or if the truth was finally clawing its way into daylight. The crowd gasped again, louder this time, as Ranger pulled back with one final tug, exposing more than anyone expected to see on a wedding day. And in that instant, the chaos turned into silence. The kind of silence that falls when a secret stands naked in front of everyone, demanding to be acknowledged. Michael's heart pounded in his ears as he realized this was not just a dog's wild outburst. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Something that would unravel every dream he thought he was stepping into. The silence that followed the chaos at the wedding was deafening. But inside Michael Hayes's mind, another sound rose from the depths of his memory. Crackling flames, shattering glass, the roar of a fire that had once swallowed a building whole. As Emily's torn dress and the gasps of the guests faded from his focus, his mind slipped back years earlier to the night that had forged his bond with Ranger, Shadow, and Scout. It was the night he learned to never question their instincts. It had been late, long past the hour when the city usually quieted down, when a call came over the radio that jolted every firefighter from their moment of rest. A warehouse on the edge of the industrial district had erupted into flames. The building stored chemical solvents and flammable materials that could turn any spark into an explosion. Michael remembered the way the alarm's piercing tone cut through his bones, the adrenaline coursing through him as he grabbed his gear and climbed into the truck. The night air had been thick with the scent of smoke long before they reached the scene. And when they did, the sight was unforgettable. The sky glowing red as if the sun itself had fallen to earth, flames twisting and reaching into the darkness like furious hands. The fire chief shouted orders. Teams rushed to contain the blaze, and Michael was paired with his 3 companions. Ranger, the seasoned German shepherd with years of service. Shadow, younger and quicker with a mind that read danger before humans could. And Scout, the loyal Labrador, whose strength often saved lives when every second counted. Together they formed a unit built not only on training, but on trust that ran deeper than words. The heat was unbearable, a wave of suffocation that pressed against his gear as he entered the warehouse. Inside visibility was near zero. Smoke coiled through the air in choking black sheets, and the only light came from the orange glow of the fire devouring the beams above. Michael's lungs burned even through the mask. Each breath heavy, each step weighted by the uncertainty of what waited in the next corner. "Stay close," he had muttered, though he knew the dogs didn't need the reminder. Ranger took the lead, his silhouette barely visible through the haze, his ears erect, his nose twitching as he navigated the shifting corridors. His paws moved with the precision of memory, as though he carried a map no human could see. Every turn he took was deliberate, pulling Michael deeper into the labyrinth of smoke, away from collapsing beams and falling sparks. Then it happened. An explosion from somewhere deep within the building shook the ground under their feet. The walls trembled, debris rained down, and for a moment Michael thought the entire structure would come down around them. He heard shouts from outside, distant through the crackle of fire. But all that mattered was surviving the next few seconds. A beam collapsed just ahead, sending sparks in a violent spray that illuminated Ranger's determined face. The shepherd didn't flinch. He looked back once, meeting Michael's eyes, and pressed forward. Shadow moved like a shadow indeed, weaving through fallen rubble, pausing at intersections where smoke twisted like living creatures. His body froze suddenly, head tilting toward a narrow passage barely visible behind a stack of containers. Michael almost missed it, his human eyes unable to see what Shadow already knew. The Malinois barked sharply, his body angled toward the hidden way. Without hesitation, Michael followed, crouching low, feeling the heat lick at his back. That single decision, guided by Shadow's unwavering instinct, would later haunt him with its clarity. Because just seconds later, the corridor behind them collapsed in a thunderous crash, flames shooting up in a deadly wave. Had Shadow not chosen that moment, that path, Michael would never have walked out alive. They pressed deeper, and the air grew heavier. Michael could feel exhaustion clawing at his muscles, his heartbeat pounding with the rhythm of survival. And then came the sound, a faint cry beneath the roar of the fire. He froze. It was human, desperate, lost. He shouted through the mask, "Hold on!" But the only answer was another weak cry. Ranger's ears twitched, and he darted toward the sound without hesitation. Michael and the other 2 followed, pushing through fallen beams and blistering heat. They found him, an older worker, trapped beneath a twisted metal shelf that had pinned his leg. His face was blackened with soot, his breath's shallow eyes filled with terror. Michael dropped to his knees trying to lift the debris, but it wouldn't budge. Flames crept closer, time slipping through their fingers like sand. Scout Michael called out desperation in his voice. The Labrador stepped forward, muscles tense, eyes locked onto his handler's plea. He lowered his body, wedged his powerful shoulders under the corner of the metal, and strained with all his strength. His claws dug into the concrete, his body trembling as he pulled. The weight seemed immovable, yet Scout's determination was unbreakable. Michael added his own strength, grunting through the effort, and finally the shelf shifted just enough for the man to be dragged free. The worker collapsed into Michael's arms, coughing violently, but alive. Alive because 3 dogs refused to surrender. There was no time to rest. The fire surged again, a section of the roof groaning under the strain. Michael hauled the man up, urging him forward, while Ranger once more took the lead. Every step was a race against the building itself, each second measured against the next collapse. Shadow kept darting ahead, circling back his movements, frantic but precise, always ensuring they followed the safest path. Scout stayed close behind, pressing against Michael's leg, as though his strength alone could carry them both. They reached a dead end. A wall of flames blocked their way, heat searing through their gear. Panic clawed at Michael's chest, his mind racing for options, but Shadow barked again, sharp and insistent. He darted toward the side where a narrow crack in the wall let in a faint breath of cooler air. A forgotten maintenance door. Michael hadn't seen it, hadn't even thought it could exist, but Shadow had known. He rammed his shoulder against it, pushing with everything he had until the latch gave way. The door swung open to reveal the night outside, where sirens wailed and firefighters shouted in relief. Michael staggered out with the rescued worker collapsing onto the pavement as medics rushed forward. His mask slipped off, and he gasped fresh air, as though tasting life for the first time again. His vision blurred with tears, some from smoke, some from the crushing realization of what had just happened. Ranger stood beside him, chest rising and falling steadily. His eyes calm, as though this was just another mission completed. Shadow paced restlessly, adrenaline still coursing through his frame. Scout leaned against Michael, his tongue lolling out, tail wagging faintly despite exhaustion. They were not just dogs. They were saviors. That night burned itself into Michael's soul. It was the night he learned that trust was not a choice, it was survival. Ranger had guided him through the unknown. Shadow had seen the path no one else could. Scout had given every ounce of strength to pull a man from the grip of death. Together they had turned an impossible night into a miracle. As the memory faded, Michael returned to the present, standing at the altar with torn lace at his feet, and 3 dogs who had once again acted with a certainty he could not ignore. Around him, guests whispered. Emily wept, and the world demanded explanations. But Michael's heart remembered. His faith in Ranger, Shadow, and Scout had been forged in fire and nothing. Not a wedding, not a scandal, not even the disbelief of 100 people could erase what he knew in his bones. The garden was still thick with gasps and murmurs when the last shred of lace tore loose in Ranger's jaws. The fabric fluttered to the grass like a fallen veil, and beneath the shredded layers of white, something dark glinted in the sunlight. For a second, no one could understand what they were looking at. It wasn't silk, it wasn't a ribbon, it was a hard edge, black and unnatural against the softness of the gown. Michael's breath hitched as his eyes locked on the strange object. The violinists had stopped playing long ago, and now the only sound was Emily's panicked sobs and the low growls of Shadow and Scout holding their ground. Michael stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching over fallen petals and lace. Every heartbeat felt like a drum in his ears. He reached down, pushing aside the torn fabric with a trembling hand, and lifted the device. It was no trinket, no ornament meant for decoration. It was rectangular, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, but heavy with purpose. A tiny red light blinked on its side, pulsing steadily, like the beat of a hidden heart. He turned it over once, then twice, and recognition crashed into him. It was a recorder. Not just recording, but transmitting. The faint hum, the blinking light, the way the air seemed to tighten around him. This was no accident. The crowd erupted in a fresh wave of shock. "What is that?" someone cried out. "Is it part of the dress?" whispered another. Mothers pulled children closer, fathers muttered under their breath, and the officiant clutched his book as though it could shield him from whatever truth was unraveling before their eyes. Emily's face drained of color. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but nothing came. Her hands shook as she tried to gather what was left of her gown, pressing the torn fabric against herself, as if covering the object could erase the fact that it had been there at all. She stammered, It's nothing." It must be. But the words broke apart in the air, fragile as glass. Michael held the recorder higher, his voice low but heavy with disbelief. "This was sewn into your dress." The words carried across the aisle louder than he intended, and the crowd stirred restlessly, whispers turning sharp suspicion, thickening like smoke. A man stepped forward from the front rows, Michael's cousin David, a quiet figure until this moment, his life spent working in security and electronics. He raised his hand as if asking permission to approach, then carefully walked toward Michael. "Let me see it," he said, his tone calm but urgent. Michael handed it over his fingers, reluctant to let go, as though passing the device might mean surrendering control of the truth. David crouched, slightly turning the recorder in his skilled hands. His brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing with concentration. He pressed a button on the side, and a faint crackle filled the air. He tapped at another switch, then looked up sharply. "It's live," he announced, his voice carrying like a gavel strike. "It's not just recording, it's transmitting. Someone somewhere is listening right now." The garden froze. Guests exchanged horrified glances. Mothers gasped and fathers cursed under their breath. The idea hung in the air like a thundercloud. Every word, every vow, every whisper meant for this sacred ceremony had been stolen, broadcast into the hands of an unseen stranger. Emily stumbled backward, her heels catching on the torn fabric, her bouquet long forgotten at her feet. She shook her head violently, strands of hair falling loose around her face. No, that's not what it looks like," she pleaded, her voice trembling. But the look in her eyes betrayed her panic guilt, something she could not mask even beneath the layers of mascara and carefully painted lipstick. Michael felt the weight of the world shift. His chest tightened as though a fist had wrapped around his lungs, squeezing the air from him. His heart wanted to deny it, to cling to the dream he had walked into this morning. But the device in David's hands pulsed with undeniable proof. The guests erupted in noise, accusations, questions, gasps. Who would plant that? Why is it in the dress? What is going on? The air turned heavy with suspicion, not just at Emily, but at the entire ceremony. The fairy tale had shattered, and in its place was a scene that felt stolen from a nightmare. Ranger sat close to Michael's leg, his body rigid, his eyes never leaving Emily. Shadow held his stance in the aisle, blocking her from retreating toward the altar. Scout paced in slow circles, his deep growl rolling every time a guest shifted too close. Their unity was absolute. Whatever danger they had sensed, it had led them to this, and now they stood like sentinels guarding the truth. David adjusted the recorder again and shook his head. "There's a frequency, it's open. It means there's someone on the other end right now. Listening." He glanced toward Michael, his voice lower now, grave. "This wasn't placed here by accident. Someone wanted to hear what happened today." Michael's jaw tightened. He looked at Emily, really looked, and for the first time, her smile, her laughter, the soft words she had whispered during long nights together. All of it seemed fragile, like paint covering cracks in a wall. His voice was steady, but colder than he had ever heard himself. "Emily," he said. "Who put this in your dress?" Her eyes darted left then right, as though the answer might appear among the guests. Her lips parted trembling, but no explanation came. She clutched the fabric tighter against herself, tears streaking her face. But the silence that followed her was more damning than any confession. Around them, the wedding had dissolved into chaos. The officiant closed his book, his hands trembling. The musicians had abandoned their instruments. Guests were already gathering their belongings, muttering about leaving before things got worse. But no one moved too close. No one dared to step past Scout's protective barrier. Michael stood still in the eye of the storm, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart splitting under the weight of betrayal and confusion. He had walked to this day believing in love, in partnership, in a future built on trust. Now all he saw was the blinking red light of a recorder that should never have been there. And as David lifted the device once more, bringing it closer to his ear, the faint static, shifted voices crackled through, faint but unmistakable. The crowd fell silent again, every breath held, every gaze fixed on the tiny box in his hand. Someone was speaking. Someone beyond the walls of this garden, and the truth that was about to spill out promised to change everything. Michael's stomach turned cold as stone. He knew the sound would come next. He knew a voice would break through the static, a voice that would either confirm his worst fears or prove that everything he believed in was built on lies. He stared at Emily, who stood trembling in her ruined gown, her lips quivering, her eyes wide as if she already knew what was coming. The static from the recorder deepened, scratching at the air like claws on glass, until finally it gave way to something clearer, something human. A woman's voice broke through, soft at first, almost hesitant, and then unmistakable. It was Emily's voice. Gasps erupted through the garden guests, clutching their mouths, eyes darting between the trembling bride and the device in David's hand. Michael felt the blood rush from his face as the sound continued, filling the silence with words that no vow could ever erase. Emily's recorded voice was calm, deliberate, and carried no trace of the panic she wore now. "Don't worry," she said, the words cruel in their confidence. "I'll marry him. Once we're settled, once everything is signed, I'll make sure the insurance is updated. Then we follow through with the plan. He won't suspect a thing. We'll get the payout and disappear." The crowd stirred violently, the whispers transforming into an angry roar. Mothers pulled their children closer. Older relatives shook their heads in disbelief, and some shouted openly at Emily, their voices filled with betrayal. But the recording did not stop. Another voice entered, deep, masculine, rough around the edges. Michael froze. He knew that voice. Brian Miller. Once his brother in arms, once a firefighter who had stood beside him in burning buildings until the day greed had carved its rot into his soul. Brian had been expelled from the department for theft and fraud, a man Michael had cut from his life like a poisoned limb. And now his voice filled the garden like a ghost, returning to destroy what little peace Michael had left. "It'll be easy," Brian's recorded voice rasped. "He's blinded by love. The payout is big enough for both of us to start over. He'll never see it coming. And those dogs? They're old, they won't be a problem." The words stabbed deeper than the flames of any fire Michael had ever faced. His knees weakened, his chest tightened, and for a moment he thought the ground itself might give way beneath him. The woman he had chosen, the woman he had trusted with his future, had plotted his downfall alongside the man he once called a brother. Emily collapsed into sobs, shaking her head violently, her voice high and broken. "It's not true. It's not what it sounds like. It was a mistake, it was." Her words dissolved into the angry shouts of the guests. No one believed her. The evidence was still playing every sentence, twisting the knife deeper into Michael's chest. He stood motionless, his body a statue carved by shock, while inside he felt himself shatter into pieces. The vows they had rehearsed, the tender words she had whispered in the quiet of night, every promise they dissolved under the cruel light of the recording. His heart, once beating with nervous hope just moments ago, now thudded in hollow disbelief. Ranger pressed closer to his side, the old shepherd's body tense, his eyes burning into Emily as though he could see beyond her tears to the truth she still tried to bury. Shadow paced a slow circle, his body low, his muscles coiled as though waiting for the next danger to reveal itself. Scout's chest rumbled with a steady growl. His gaze locked on the guests, who shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to leave or to stay, and witness the unraveling of something sacred. The unity of the three dogs was a fortress around Michael, one that reminded him of nights in burning warehouses and collapsing buildings, when trust in them was the only thing that had kept him alive. And now, on the day that was meant to bind him to love, it was their instincts that stood between him and ruin once more. The recording played on unrelenting. Emily's voice again colder this time. "Once it's done, Brian, we'll disappear. Spain maybe, or South America. Somewhere no one will find us. He's too busy saving everyone else to notice what's happening in his own home." A bitter laugh followed from Brian, the sound of a man who had lost honor long ago. "Perfect. By the time anyone suspects, we'll be gone, and he'll be nothing more than a tragic story." The recorder clicked softly as the audio looped, returning to static. David lowered the device, his face pale, his hands trembling despite years of training to stay steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air like thick smoke, inescapable, undeniable, suffocating. Michael's eyes stung his throat dry as he struggled to breathe through the storm inside him. Betrayal was a fire that burned hotter than any flame he had ever known, and it was burning him alive from the inside out. He looked at Emily, her makeup streaked, her hands clutched around the ruined gown, her words frantic and hollow. She reached for him, but he stepped back. His jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Guests began to leave, shaking their heads, muttering about scandal and shame. Some lingered, too stunned to move, unable to tear their eyes away from the collapse of what should have been a sacred union. The officiant closed his book quietly and walked away, his face solemn. The violinists had long since disappeared, leaving only the sound of Emily's sobs and the steady growls of three dogs who refused to let the lie close in again. Michael wanted to scream, to demand why, to beg for an explanation, but the words would not come. All he could feel was the hollow ache of a man who had handed over his heart and watched it shatter in front of 100 witnesses. His world spun not from the fire this time, but from betrayal, the kind of betrayal that turned dreams into ashes. And yet, through the chaos, through the pain, one thought anchored him. The dogs had known. Ranger, Shadow, and Scout had seen through the veil of lace and promises. They had ripped apart the lie, exposed the truth, and stood between him and a future built on deceit. Their loyalty had saved him, even when he hadn't seen the danger himself. Emily's cries grew louder, her voice hoarse as she tried to plead with anyone who would listen, but the guests no longer looked at her with sympathy. Their faces hardened with disgust, pity, or cold indifference. She had been caught, her secret torn open not by human suspicion, but by the instincts of three animals who loved Michael more than she ever had. Michael turned his eyes away, unable to watch her anymore. His gaze dropped to the recorder, still glowing faintly in David's hands. That blinking light, that tiny pulse, felt like the echo of a bomb that had already exploded, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. And yet, in the quiet moments between the shouting and the heavy silence that fell when the guests finally began to scatter, Michael felt something stir deep inside him. It was not hope, not yet. It was something simpler, more primal. A need to know how deep this betrayal went. Because if Emily had carried a secret this dangerous into his wedding, then the truth that still waited beyond this garden might be darker than he could ever imagine. He lowered his head, his hands trembling at his sides, and let the weight of the moment press into him like the falling beams of a burning building. He had survived flames before. He would survive this too. But only if he kept listening, only if he trusted the instincts of the companions who had never let him down. The garden that had once been dressed in flowers and light now felt like a stage left in ruins. Chairs sat crooked where guests had rushed to leave petals that once floated gently down the aisle, were crushed under hurried steps, and the air was heavy with the weight of whispers that still clung to the stone walls of the estate. What had begun as a day for vows and celebration had turned into a storm of betrayal, and the guests could no longer bear to stay inside it. One by one they filed out their voices, sharp with anger, shock, and disbelief. Some shook their heads in pity for Michael. Others hissed their disgust at Emily, but none remained long enough to pretend this could still be salvaged. Emily stood in the center of it all. The once beautiful bride, her gown torn and stained, her hands clutching at the wreckage of lace as if it could hold together the life unraveling around her. Her eyes darted wildly first to the guests leaving, then to Michael, who stood as still as a statue at the altar. His face unreadable, his heart locked behind walls that had been built in an instant. She tried to move toward him, her steps stumbling, her voice breaking as she cried, "Michael, please! You have to listen to me. It isn't what it looks like." But Michael didn't answer. His chest rose and fell heavily. His jaw clenched tight, his eyes fixed not on her but on the ground at his feet. He had no words left for her, no patience for explanations that already rang hollow before they were spoken. The recorder had been enough. The voices had been enough. And in the pit of his stomach, he felt the truth he had been too blinded to see before. The families were frozen, torn between rage and humiliation. Michael's mother stood with her hands over her mouth, her shoulders trembling as though she might collapse under the weight of what her son had just endured. His father's face was stone, his fists clenched at his sides, every muscle tight with fury he could not unleash. On the other side of the aisle, Emily's parents tried desperately to gather their daughter into their arms, their voices hushed but urgent, telling her to calm down, to stop crying, to leave quietly before things grew worse. But Emily shook them off, her tears falling freely, her desperation pushing her forward toward Michael. "Please," she sobbed again, her arms reaching out as though she could physically pull him back into the dream that had crumbled. "I never meant for this to happen. You don't understand. I love you, Her words were cut short by a deep growl. Ranger had risen from his place at Michael's side, only to settle back down again, pressing close against his handler's leg. His amber eyes fixed firmly on Emily, unblinking, steady, his presence declaring what Michael could not yet bring himself to say out loud. This woman was no longer welcome here. Shadow moved closer to the aisle, his body tense, ready to intervene if she tried to close the distance. Scout remained near the front, keeping a barrier between the fractured families and the broken groom. Their unity was as clear as their purpose. They had saved Michael before, and they had saved him again today. Michael finally placed a hand on Ranger's head, his fingers trembling as they sank into the shepherd's thick fur. The old dog leaned into the touch, grounding him, steadying him, reminding him that though his heart was breaking, he was not alone. Michael's eyes lifted, then finally meeting Emily's. There was no rage in his gaze, no screaming accusations, just the quiet, devastating emptiness of a man who no longer believed the woman standing in front of him. Emily's voice cracked as she begged again, but this time the words fell flat, echoing into the emptiness of the garden where no one remained to listen. The officiant had gone. The musicians were gone. The guests had scattered, fleeing not just the scandal, but the unbearable tension of being witnesses to the end of a union that had never truly begun. By the time the last car rolled down the long gravel drive, the only sounds that remained were the wind, rustling the leaves, Emily's quiet sobs, and the steady breathing of 3 dogs who would not let danger come closer. That night, the story did not stay in the garden. It moved swiftly, carried by phones, whispers, and messages that spread faster than wildfire. By the time the moon rose over the city, local reporters had already caught wind of the scandal. "Bride exposed at altar by groom's canine dogs," one headline read. "Another wedding disaster in suburban estate hidden device uncovered by German shepherd." And by morning, it was everywhere. Pictures taken by guests on their phones showed Emily mid-scream, her gown torn wide, Ranger snarling at her side. Videos captured Michael standing silent and broken, while the recording revealed her betrayal. Social media turned it into a frenzy of memes, debates, and cruel jokes. Michael stayed silent. He did not post, did not answer calls, did not open the flood of messages from friends, colleagues, or curious strangers. He sat in the dim light of his apartment later that night. Ranger lying pressed against his leg, shadow stretched at the doorway like a sentinel, Scout curled on the rug by his feet. The glow of his phone lit up again and again, but he could not bear to lift it. His world had already been exposed enough. In the quiet of that room, with only the sound of his dogs breathing steady around him, Michael's thoughts churned. He replayed Emily's face when the truth came out, her eyes wild, her tears frantic. He replayed Brian's voice on the recording, that familiar tone twisted now with greed and betrayal. And he replayed his own silence, the way his lips refused to move, even as his heart screamed in pain. The trust he had given so freely had been shattered. The vows he had prepared, the promises he had written in his heart, lay in ashes before they could ever be spoken. And yet, beneath the crushing weight of loss, one truth shone clear. He had not walked out of that garden destroyed. He had walked out protected, saved once again by the loyalty of 3 companions who had never wavered, who had seen what he could not, who had torn the mask away when he was too blind to do it himself. Michael leaned forward, pressing his face into Ranger's fur, inhaling the scent of smoke, earth, and age. His voice broke as he whispered, "You saved me again, old friend." Ranger lifted his head, licking the back of Michael's hand, once a gesture simple, but enough to pierce through the haze of despair. Shadow raised his ears, Scout thumped his tail gently against the rug, as though each of them understood the weight of this night. Outside those walls, the world could not stop talking. Headlines bloomed like weeds across newspapers and websites. Local stations ran the footage again and again, the moment Ranger tore through the gown, the instant Michael lifted the recorder. The shocked silence when Emily's betrayal was laid bare. Social media twisted the scene into something viral. Each clip edited, recaptioned, reshared with cruel delight. The hashtag #TheBetrayedGroom trended for 3 days straight. But the one that cut deepest was the one that refused to fade: the bride exposed. It wasn't just a scandal anymore, it had become a spectacle. Memes mocked Emily's tears, while others tried to paint Michael as a tragic hero abandoned at the altar. Strangers debated his pain as though it were entertainment, and every click, every share was another reminder that his heartbreak was no longer his own. He was no longer just Michael Hayes, the firefighter, the son, the friend. He was a headline, a hashtag, a viral story that belonged to everyone except him. The phone rang endlessly. Friends, reporters, curious acquaintances, people he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted a comment, a statement, a confession. He left the calls unanswered. Texts poured in long paragraphs of sympathy, brief notes of outrage, even strangers confessing their admiration for his strength. He read none of them. His phone stayed face down on the counter, buzzing like a trapped insect while he sat in the dark with his dogs. Ranger, ever the sentinel, took his place at Michael's side, pressing his body against his leg whenever he sank too far into the silence. Shadow paced the apartment restlessly, nose twitching at every sound from the hallway. his body tense, protective as though guarding against dangers no one else could see. Scout lay across Michael's feet, his warmth a steady anchor, his eyes watching with a quiet loyalty that needed no words. Night became Michael's only refuge. When the city quieted and the buzz of reporters outside finally dulled, he clipped leashes onto Ranger Shadow and Scout and stepped into the streets. The dogs moved in perfect unison beside him, their presence a wall between him and the shadows that reached from alleyways. They walked through empty sidewalks, past shuttered stores and dim street lamps where no cameras waited and no voices whispered his name. Those walks became ritual. The dogs never pulled ahead, never lagged behind. They walked as though they understood the fragility of the man between them, as though they knew that each step forward was not just movement through the city, but a fight against the weight that threatened to bury him. Michael breathed easier in those moments, his chest loosening his thoughts, untangling in the quiet rhythm of pause against pavement. He thought often of the warehouse fire, of how the smoke had choked the air, how the heat had pressed against his skin, how close he had come to never walking out again. That night, the dogs had carried him to safety. Now in these dark days, they carried him still not through flames, but through the ashes of trust. The city, however, did not forget. Cameras sometimes lingered near his building, waiting for a glimpse of him. Strangers whispered when they recognized his face at the corner store. Even when he lowered his cap and kept his eyes on the ground, he could feel the stares, the pity, the curiosity. They looked at him not as Michael the man, but as the story. It left him raw, as if his very skin had been stripped away. So he stayed inside. Days blurred together one into another until the clock lost meaning. Meals were skipped, then pieced together half-heartedly. The only constant was the dogs feeding them, walking them, listening to their breathing at night. They became his world. The three silent guardians who asked nothing of him except his presence. Sometimes he spoke to them in the quiet. Words he couldn't bring himself to say to another human, slipped out into the air, carried on the loyalty of ears that listened without judgment. "I should have seen it," he murmured, once his voice breaking as he leaned into Ranger's fur. "I should have known she wasn't who I thought she was." Ranger pressed closer, his eyes soft, his silence saying what no human could, that Michael had been worth saving all along. Shadow, always restless, sometimes pushed his muzzle against Michael's hand, forcing him to stand, to move, to leave the chair that had become a prison. Scout would wag his tail whenever Michael managed a faint smile, rewarding the smallest cracks in the wall he had built around himself. The outside world, though, was relentless. News stations speculated about legal consequences, about whether the recording would lead to charges. Talk shows debated whether Michael had been blind, whether Emily had been desperate, whether betrayal could ever be forgiven. Every word was a blade twisting deeper. He muted the television, but the noise still seeped in from neighbors' conversations, from radios and passing cars, from the glowing screens in store windows. His pain had been stolen, packaged, and sold as spectacle. And yet, even in that suffocating storm, there were nights when something else broke through. Nights when a child walking past would stop and stare at Ranger Shadow and Scout with wide eyes, whispering to their parent about how brave the dogs must be. Nights when strangers, not knowing he could hear, murmured quietly, "That man's lucky those dogs saved him." Those words did not heal him, but they reminded him of a truth deeper than betrayal. Michael's world had been stripped to its core. No wedding, no vows, no trust left in the woman he had chosen. But in that emptiness, he could still feel the steady presence of three lives that had never abandoned him. They had guided him through smoke, shielded him from fire, and now they guarded him through the darkest silence of his life. He didn't know how long the storm outside would last. He didn't know when the world would forget his name, or when the headlines would fade. But each night as the city slept, and he walked between Ranger's shadow and Scout in the quiet streets, he felt the faintest spark inside him. A reminder that even in darkness, loyalty could light the path forward. The weeks dragged on in quiet repetition, each day blurring into the next, each night carried on the rhythm of Ranger's shadow and Scout's steady steps against the pavement. Michael Hayes had grown used to solitude, a cocoon of silence broken only by the loyal presence of his 3 dogs. He no longer expected surprises. He no longer expected anyone from his past to reach across the wreckage of his present. But life has a way of sending what the heart has stopped asking for. It happened one afternoon when the air was cool and the streets hummed with the slow pace of a city between seasons. Michael had stepped out for errands, his cap pulled low, his jacket zipped tight, hoping to pass unnoticed. Ranger moved beside him with his steady gait. Shadow's alert eyes scanned every corner, and Scout padded at his heel with a calm rhythm. They were his shield, his comfort, his only companions. He had just exited a small market, a paper bag in his hands, when he heard a voice behind him. It was soft, familiar, in a way that struck a chord deep inside his chest, a chord he hadn't realized was still capable of vibrating. Michael. He turned slowly, almost unwillingly, and saw her. Teresa Collins. The name rose in his mind before his lips could form it. She looked older than the girl he remembered from college days, but the years had not dimmed her presence. Her hair was tied back loosely. Her eyes still carried that quiet light that always seemed to see more than what was in front of her. She wore no makeup, just a sweater and jeans. Yet something about her stood out more than all the cameras and flashing lights he had endured. For a long second, they just looked at each other. Michael's breath caught memories rushing in uninvited summer evenings on campus lawns. Laughter under dim dorm lights, the way her smile had once made the noise of the world fall away. She stepped closer, her voice low, careful as though she feared startling him. I wasn't sure it was you. I saw the dogs first, and then... She trailed off. Eyes soft with something that looked like both sorrow and warmth. Michael didn't answer at once. His voice felt trapped in his chest, tangled between surprise and the weight of all he had endured. Finally, he managed Teresa. Just her name. It was all he could say. The dogs, however, reacted in ways that told their own story. Ranger, old and cautious, usually suspicious of strangers, lifted his head toward her. His eyes scanned her face, his body tense for a moment, then softened. He stepped slightly forward enough for her to reach her hand toward him. She hesitated, then slowly extended her fingers. To Michael's astonishment, Ranger allowed it. Let her touch the fur on his head, let her fingers stroke gently without pulling away. Michael's chest tightened at the sight. Ranger didn't trust easily, not anymore. But here he was, leaning faintly into Teresa's touch. Shadow watched closely, his sharp eyes studying her, but he didn't growl or shift. Scout's tail even gave a cautious wag. The 3 dogs, so quick to guard Michael from anyone else, seemed to sense something in her that told them she was no threat. Teresa smiled faintly, her fingers lingering on Ranger's fur. "He remembers me," she said softly. Though they both knew it was more than that. Animals don't remember the way humans do, but loyalty knows how to recognize what the heart can trust. They ended up walking together that afternoon. At first, the words were few. Michael wasn't ready to speak of the scandal of Emily, of the humiliation that still burned every time he stepped outside. Teresa didn't press him. She spoke instead of small things, her work, the neighborhood memories of people they once knew. Her voice was steady, patient, weaving warmth into the spaces Michael had left cold. When they reached the park, they sat on a bench, the dogs lying at their feet like guardians at rest. Teresa glanced at him, her gaze steady. "I heard what happened," she admitted gently. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Michael. No one deserves that kind of pain. He swallowed hard, the words pressing against his throat. The whole world saw it, he said bitterly. It wasn't just betrayal. It was spectacle. Teresa didn't flinch. The world forgets, she said. But pain doesn't vanish so easily. It takes time, and it takes people who won't walk away. Her words lingered, cutting through the fog that had wrapped itself around him. He glanced down at Ranger's shadow and Scout, then back at her. I already have the only ones who haven't walked away, he said. Her smile softened, but her eyes grew damp. And they'll never leave you. But even strong men need more than loyalty. They need someone who sees them, who stands beside them when they can't stand on their own. The conversation ended there. But it was enough. Something in Michael stirred something that hadn't moved in weeks. Teresa didn't demand his trust, didn't demand his story. She simply stayed, and that was more than most had given him. In the days that followed, she appeared again. Sometimes at the park, sometimes near the store, sometimes at his door with a warm meal. She insisted was just extra from dinner. At first, Michael resisted. He tried to keep their exchanges brief, tried to retreat back into the silence he had built. But Teresa had a way of slipping past walls without breaking them. She would sit quietly with him, talk about ordinary things, let the dogs curl up at her feet as though they too had accepted her presence as natural. Ranger especially seemed to confirm what Michael's heart was too cautious to admit. The old shepherd leaned into Teresa's hand when she visited his eyes, calm, his body relaxed. It was as though he gave his silent approval, telling Michael that this was safe, that this was right. Shadow stopped pacing when she was near. Scout, usually wary of strangers, rested his head on her knee without hesitation. One evening, as the sun set over the city and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Teresa looked at Michael with a quiet seriousness. I didn't come back to stir up old memories, she said. I came back because I couldn't let you go through this alone. Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her he didn't deserve her presence, that he was too broken, too exposed. But the words died before they reached his lips. Instead, he nodded once slowly and whispered, "Thank you." The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was gentle, filled with the soft sounds of 3 dogs breathing at their feet, the distant hum of the city, and the unspoken truth that something new was beginning. The courthouse stood tall against the morning sky, its stone facade carrying the weight of centuries of judgment. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, every bench filled with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers who had followed the scandal since the wedding day. The story had burned across headlines for weeks, and now the city's eyes turned to this place, waiting for the law to pass its verdict on betrayal. Michael Hayes walked through the courthouse doors with Ranger's shadow and Scout moving in formation beside him. Their steps were steady, their eyes sharp, their presence drawing every gaze in the hallway. Court officers had made an exception for them. These weren't ordinary pets. They were guardians whose instincts had uncovered the truth, and their presence had become symbolic of the case itself. People whispered as he passed, not out of pity this time, but with something closer to reverence. When Michael entered the courtroom, he saw her. Emily Carter sat at the defendant's table, her once glamorous appearance stripped down to a simple gray suit. Her hair was tied back tightly, her eyes hollow, her hands clasped so hard her knuckles whitened. Beside her sat her lawyer, whispering frantically. But Emily's gaze flickered only once toward Michael. It was not the look of a woman in love, not even the look of a woman ashamed. It was the look of someone trapped, cornered by the very truth she had tried to bury. Across the aisle sat Brian Miller. Once a firefighter like Michael, now reduced to a shadow of the man he used to be. His beard was unkempt, his posture slouched, his eyes fixed firmly on the table, as if he could hide from the weight of the charges. Michael's jaw tightened at the sight of him. This was the man who had once carried hoses into burning buildings beside him, the man who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve. And here he was, awaiting judgment for a crime of greed that had nearly destroyed everything. The judge entered the room rising as one. Proceedings began, words flowing like a tide, indictments, evidence, arguments. Prosecutors laid out the case with sharp precision, a plot to marry under false pretenses, to update insurance policies, and to profit from betrayal. The recording was central, and soon enough the device itself was presented. Michael's cousin David testified first, explaining its discovery, its transmission, its undeniable authenticity. Then came Michael's turn. He walked to the stand, his dogs waiting quietly in the front row, their eyes never leaving him. The oath was simple truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. But as he raised his hand, his chest tightened. This wasn't the kind of truth he was used to telling. It wasn't about fires and rescues. It was about trust, heartbreak, and betrayal under the gaze of 100 eyes. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying through the room. He recounted the wedding day, the moment Ranger lunged at Emily's dress, the shock of seeing the device, the chaos that followed. He described how Shadow had blocked Emily's path, how Scout had held the crowd at bay. His words painted the picture vividly. And as he spoke, the courtroom leaned forward, caught in the weight of a story that sounded almost too unbelievable, yet had already been seen by the world through videos and headlines. When the prosecutor asked if he recognized the voices on the recording, Michael's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. Yes, the woman was Emily Carter. The man was Brian Miller. I knew them both. I trusted them both. And they betrayed that trust. The audio was played again, echoing through the room. Emily's calm plotting, Brian's cruel laugh. It filled the courtroom like a haunting chorus. Gasps rippled through the spectators, just as they had at the wedding, but this time no one doubted. The evidence was ironclad. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras sketched the scene with words that would later fill headlines. But Michael did not hear them. His gaze was fixed on the recorder, on the blinking light that had once torn his world apart. Now it stood as proof that the betrayal hadn't been in his head, that the pain wasn't just humiliation, but a crime against his very life. During a recess, the judge granted the unusual request to allow Ranger, Shadow, and Scout to sit closer near the witness stand. The reasoning was simple. Their actions were inseparable from the facts of the case. When court resumed, the three dogs sat like statues, their presence unshakable. To the jury, to the spectators, they were more than animals. They were the guardians of truth. Emily's lawyer tried desperately to spin the story, claiming the recording was a joke, a fabrication, a misunderstanding taken out of context. But the jury's eyes had already shifted. They looked not at the lawyer's words, but at Emily's trembling hands, at her downcast eyes, at the way she avoided looking at Michael, or the dogs who had once stood by her at the altar. Lies cannot stand long against eyes that have already seen the truth. Brian's defense was weaker still. His history weighed against him, his expulsion from the department, his record of fraud, the bitterness that had long trailed his name. The recording showed not only his voice, but his intent. When questioned directly, his silence was louder than any denial. Finally, closing arguments were made, words thrown like stones across the aisle. The jury withdrew the room, buzzing with tension, every breath held. Michael sat quietly, his dogs pressed close, his hands buried in Ranger's fur as though grounding himself in the one loyalty that had never broken. Hours passed before the jury returned. The room rose, silence falling heavy as the foreman stood. His words cut clean through the stillness. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant, Emily Carter, guilty. On the charge of attempted insurance fraud, we find the defendant, Brian Miller, guilty. The air broke with murmurs, gasps, and the frantic scratching of pens. Emily collapsed into her chair, tears streaking her face, her lawyer's hand on her shoulder, doing nothing to steady her. Brian lowered his head further. His jaw locked, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's. The judge's gavel struck once, twice sealing the verdict. Sentences would follow, appeals would be filed. But the truth had been spoken. Justice had arrived. Michael did not cheer, did not smile. He simply sat still. Ranger leaning against him, Shadow resting at his feet, Scout's tail brushing the floor in quiet rhythm. Relief did not feel like triumph. It felt like an exhale after holding his breath for too long. Outside, reporters swarmed cameras, flashing questions, shouted. "How do you feel, Michael? Do you think justice was served? What's next for you?" He said nothing. He kept walking, his dogs flanking him, their bodies forming the same unbreakable wall they always had. The world might hunger for his pain, might twist his story into something to consume. But here, surrounded by the only companions who had never failed him, Michael found a silence stronger than the noise outside. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, the gavel struck. To the public, the story of Michael Hayes seemed finished. The firefighter betrayed by his bride, the loyal dogs, who exposed the lie, the courtroom victory that sealed justice. But Michael knew better. He had carried enough scars from fire to recognize when heat still lingered in the air, when a blaze wasn't truly out. Life tried to return to normal. Reporters moved on to other stories, neighbors stopped whispering when he walked past, and the city's attention shifted to fresher scandals. Yet Michael couldn't shake the unease inside him. Nights felt heavier, the silence sharper. Ranger often lifted his head in the dark, ears twitching at noises beyond the walls. Shadow paced the apartment more than usual, his body tense as though sensing movement no one else could. Scout would pause at the window, staring into the street with a low rumble in his chest. Then the letter arrived. It came in an envelope without a return address, slipped under his door one morning as though placed there by unseen hands. The paper was plain, the handwriting neat, but hurried, the kind of script that spoke of someone who had written this in haste, but with deliberate intent. At the top of the page, the name was written clearly: Lawrence Abbott. Michael's brow furrowed. He knew the name. A decade ago, Abbott had been a colleague of Brian Miller's at a private security firm after both men had left the fire department. The details were hazy, but Michael remembered whispers of questionable contracts, rumors of jobs that skirted legality. Abbott had vanished from Brian's circle years ago, at least on the surface. Michael unfolded the letter and read, "Mr. Hayes, I do not write this out of curiosity, but out of necessity. You believe what happened at your wedding was a fraud for money, a betrayal of trust between two people. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. Brian was never working alone, and Emily was not only after your insurance. What you uncovered was a small piece of something larger, something dangerous. I once worked alongside Brian. I left when I realized the lines we were crossing. He was involved with people far beyond our city contacts, tied to smuggling networks, corporate espionage, even international defense contracts. The device hidden in Emily's gown was not simply a recorder. It was meant to transport data, highly sensitive information, to people who paid handsomely to remain unseen. You are in danger, Mr. Hayes. I cannot explain everything here, but know this: what you found was only the surface. Those behind Brian will not forgive mistakes, and they will not ignore you. Protect yourself. Protect your dogs. They see more than you realize. Lawrence Abbott." Michael read the letter 3 times, his pulse quickening with each pass. At first, he wanted to dismiss it as paranoia from a disgruntled ex-associate. But then he looked at Ranger's Shadow and Scout, each watching him intently, as though they could sense the weight of the words. His chest tightened. He thought of the device, of the way the dogs had targeted it with unrelenting precision, of the way the court had focused on fraud while ignoring the blinking red light that had seemed to carry something darker. By nightfall, the unease had grown into something undeniable. It began with the car. Parked outside his building for 3 nights in a row, the same dark sedan with tinted windows. He noticed it when he took the dogs out, its engine off, its silhouette silent but unmistakable. Shadow bristled each time, his body lowering, ears forward, gaze locked on the vehicle. Ranger sniffed the air, growling low, while Scout pulled closer to Michael's side, his tail stiff. Then came the calls. The phone rang late at night, always from a blocked number. When he answered, there was no voice, only silence, heavy and deliberate, as though someone was listening for his breathing. Once he heard a faint click, as if a recording had begun. Another time, just before the call ended, a voice whispered, distorted and unrecognizable, "You should have walked away." Michael's sleep grew restless. He woke to creaks in the hallway, to footsteps that seemed to vanish when he listened harder. Ranger often sat by the door for hours, his ears alert, his body tense. Shadow's pacing grew constant circles through the apartment, as though drawing invisible boundaries. Scout slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, his growl a warning before Michael even stirred. He began to write things down, license plates of cars that seemed to follow him, times of the silent calls, shadows he thought he saw moving across the street. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia or reality, but the dog's behavior confirmed what his heart feared. He was being watched. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city lights flickered on, Michael sat at his kitchen table with the letter from Abbott spread out before him. He read the words again, tracing each line with his eyes. He thought of the trial, of Emily's pale face, of Brian's silence. He thought of the device sewn into the dress, of the blinking red light. His hands clenched. This was bigger than betrayal. This was bigger than him. He reached down, scratching Ranger's ears, the old shepherd's eyes steady and knowing. "What have we stepped into, old boy?" he whispered. Ranger leaned into the touch, silent but sure, as if to say they would face it together. Shadow sat near the door, ears pricked at every sound, while Scout pressed close to Michael's leg, grounding him against the storm rising beyond the walls. And then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the door. Not loud, not frantic, controlled, deliberate. Michael froze, his body tightening. Ranger growled. Deep, Shadow lunged halfway to the door before stopping. Scout stood stiff, his tail raised. Michael's heart pounded in his ears. Slowly he approached, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. When he opened the door, only an envelope sat on the floor. He bent down, picked it up, and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed in black ink. "We know who you are. We know where you live. Stop asking questions." Michael's hands trembled as he lowered the page. The dogs gathered tighter around him, their bodies tense, their eyes scanning the hall. The current beneath his life had risen to the surface. This was no longer about betrayal at a wedding. This was about survival against enemies he could not yet see. One evening, Michael sat at his desk, the dim light of a single lamp washing over the object that had started it all, the device torn from Emily's gown. It had been locked away for evidence during the trial. But after the verdict, authorities allowed him to keep it temporarily, before it was filed officially. He should have handed it in sooner. But something inside him told him to look closer. He wanted to understand why his dogs had targeted it so fiercely, why a simple recorder had triggered such relentless focus. He turned it over in his hands, the blinking red light now dark, but the weight of it still unsettling. With careful movements, he connected it to his laptop. At first, the screen showed nothing unusual, just blank files with dates. But when he clicked, deeper layers unfolded, encrypted folders, strings of code that didn't resemble ordinary recordings. His background as a firefighter hadn't prepared him for digital secrets. But even he could see this was not simple fraud. These weren't love notes or financial details. They were data packets, heavy, structured, protected by encryption so tight it hummed like a locked vault. He took screenshots, forwarded them to a contact he trusted in law enforcement. Within hours, the response came urgent and clipped. Do not handle this further. This is national security. Expect contact. By the next morning, his quiet apartment filled with the presence of federal agents. Men and women in dark suits spoke in low voices, their faces tense as they examined the device. The emblem on their folders read FBI, but one man introduced himself as Europol liaison, his accent sharp, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. This was bigger than a city scandal, bigger than betrayal. The device had contained fragments of encrypted defense data, classified contracts, schematics, communications that hinted at weapon systems not meant for any public eye. Michael sat in stunned silence as they explained. The recorder had not simply been transmitting his wedding. It had piggybacked onto secure lines, siphoning information, delivering it elsewhere. His wedding had been used as a cover, a harmless-seeming ceremony, hiding the passage of data across international borders. He clenched his fists, his stomach churning as he realized how close he had stood to something far darker than heartbreak. Emily and Brian had been pawns in something global, their greed manipulated by those who wanted more than money. He looked down at Ranger lying by his feet. Shadow pacing near the door, Scout pressed against his leg. They had known. Somehow in their instincts, they had understood this wasn't about lace or vows. It was about survival. The agents came and went over the next week, leaving Michael with warnings and a constant presence of surveillance outside his building. But even with federal eyes watching, he knew he wasn't safe. The calls continued, voices distorted, threats whispered. Cars idled longer than they should on his street. Once returning home, he found his front door lock scratched as if someone had tried to force entry, but stopped before finishing. That night, Ranger alerted first. His growl woke Michael from shallow sleep, a sound that rumbled low and dangerous from the old shepherd's chest. Shadow was already at the window, his body rigid, his gaze sharp toward the street below. Scout had planted himself by the door, teeth bared, tail stiff. Michael crept to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to see. A shadow moved in the alley across the street, tall, deliberate. When Michael flicked the light on, the figure melted back into darkness. He rushed to the door, the dogs flanking him like soldiers, but when he opened it, the hall was empty. Only silence and the faint echo of retreating footsteps. 2 nights later, he returned from a late walk to find the threat no longer hidden. On his doorstep lay a folded piece of cloth. He bent down, his stomach sinking before his fingers even touched it. When he unfolded the fabric, his breath caught. It was a white bandana, identical to the one Ranger had worn at the wedding, once tied proudly around his neck in celebration. Across the cloth, scrawled in thick black ink, were 4 words. This isn't over yet. Michael's hands trembled as he clutched the bandana. Ranger pressed close, his body tense, growling softly, as if he too understood the insult. Shadow circled the entryway, nose twitching furiously, while Scout pressed against Michael's leg, anchoring him. The message was clear. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. He locked the door, his chest heaving as he leaned against it. The dogs gathered around him, their eyes steady, their loyalty unshaken. But Michael knew what the cloth meant. The trial hadn't ended the threat. It had only opened the door to something deeper, darker. A shadow network that had marked him not as a victim anymore, but as an obstacle. One morning, long before the city stirred awake, Michael loaded Ranger, Shadow, and Scout into his truck and drove back to the countryside. The road stretched long and quiet, lined with autumn trees that whispered in the cold breeze. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, his jaw set. The farm estate where his wedding had collapsed still stood abandoned after the scandal, its gates locked, its gardens overgrown. But Michael wasn't going there for memories. He was going for answers. The dogs stirred restlessly as the truck rolled to a stop near the property line. Ranger's head lifted, eyes sharp, ears twitching. Shadow pressed against the window, scanning the grounds, while Scout let out a low rumble in his chest. They sensed it too. The air was not just heavy with the stillness of an empty estate. It was alive with something hidden. Michael cut the engine and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots, breaking the silence. He moved toward the main hall, the dogs fanning out in instinctive formation. The once pristine venue bore scars of abandonment weeds climbing the stone walls. Broken chairs stacked against the side flower beds wilted into dust. Yet as Michael crossed the aisle where a vase had once turned to ashes, a strange pull urged him deeper inside. He entered the banquet hall. Its chandeliers dimmed the echoes of laughter long gone. The air smelled of dust and wood polish left to fade. He swept his flashlight across the corners, searching for something, anything, that would explain the letter from Lawrence Abbott, the threats. The sense that all of this was part of a much larger game. Ranger suddenly stiffened his growl, low, his eyes locked on a corner near the far wall. Michael followed the shepherd's gaze, his own chest tightening. He moved closer, brushing aside a draped cloth that hung carelessly over a shelf. And there it was. A camera. Small, disguised, tucked into the paneling with precision. Its lens, though dusty, still gleamed faintly under the flashlight beam. Michael's breath caught. This wasn't part of any wedding decoration. This was surveillance. He crouched, inspecting it closer. The wiring ran deeper into the wall, carefully hidden, connected to a power source that suggested permanence. Someone had been recording long before the chaos at the altar. He reached out to remove it, but stopped himself. Instead, he pulled his phone and snapped pictures, then called the contact number he had been given by the federal agents. Within the hour, unmarked vehicles arrived at the estate. Men and women in dark jackets moved in swiftly, carrying cases of equipment. They handled the camera with gloved hands, their expressions tight as they traced the wires and unearthed additional devices hidden throughout the hall. Not just one, an agent muttered. There are at least 5, all positioned to capture every angle of the ceremony. Michael's stomach churned. His wedding had never been about vows. It had been about access. Cameras hidden in the walls, a recorder sewn into a gown, a web designed to pull in data, while everyone's eyes were fixed on a celebration. He felt sick as he realized how completely he had been used not just by Emily, not just by Brian, but by an invisible network that had chosen his life as the stage for their operation. Then came the discovery that turned suspicion into certainty. One of the agents replayed the footage from the camera's memory drive. The grainy video showed figures moving in the background, during the wedding servers carrying trays, attendants adjusting decorations. But as the frame slowed, Michael's blood ran cold. One face stood out. A server he didn't recognize, a man who had moved with unusual confidence, slipping in and out of the crowd unnoticed. His uniform was identical to the catering staff, but his posture, his focus betrayed him. The agents froze the frame, zooming in on his features. "That's him," one whispered. "We've seen him before." Files were pulled, photos compared, and soon the truth emerged. The man wasn't a server at all. He was identified as an operative connected to a known espionage ring in Eastern Europe, his name flagged on multiple watch lists. His presence at the wedding was no coincidence. He had been planted there, disguised part of the same network that had orchestrated the transmission of data. Michael felt his chest tighten as the realization sank in. He had been targeted not just for who he was, but for what the event could provide. His wedding had been a perfect cover, crowds, noise, distractions. It wasn't about Emily's betrayal alone. It was about using his life as camouflage for an operation stretching across borders. As agents dismantled the devices, gathering them into evidence bags, Michael stood in the aisle with his dogs. Ranger pressed close against his side, Shadow paced with restless energy. Scout leaned into him as though grounding him. Together they watched as the truth unfolded. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a thread woven into a much larger tapestry of espionage, one that stretched far beyond his understanding. By the end of the day, federal officials confirmed what Michael already suspected. The evidence tied the devices to multiple countries. Data fragments linked to defense contracts in the United States, energy grids in Europe, and communications in Asia. His wedding had been one node in a sprawling network of theft and surveillance. The operatives were ghosts, their faces scattered across international files, their loyalties tied not to nations, but to money and power. Michael listened numb as the agents explained. But in his heart, he felt the weight of a different truth. He and his dogs had stumbled into something vast, dangerous, and relentless. They were not the beginning of this story, and they would not be the end. They were simply caught in its current. That night, as the estate stood dark once more, Michael lingered outside with Ranger Shadow and Scout. The wind moved through the fields, carrying the chill of autumn. He looked at the building where his future had been meant to begin, now revealed as nothing more than a stage for lies. His fists tightened at his sides. He wasn't naive anymore. He knew now that loyalty and love had been twisted into tools by people who lived in the shadows. And he knew, too, that the fight wasn't finished. He was only one man with 3 loyal companions, standing against a tide that stretched across nations. But they had faced fire before. They had walked through flames and survived. Michael knelt, resting a hand on Ranger's back, another on Shadow's head, while Scout pressed his muzzle into his arm. "We're in something bigger than us," he whispered, his voice rough but steady. "But we'll face it together." The dogs leaned into him, their bodies strong, their presence unshakable. For a moment, in the quiet of the countryside, Michael felt the weight of truth settle on his shoulders. He was no longer just a man betrayed at the altar. He was part of a larger story, one written in the hidden lines of espionage and loyalty. Emily's fate was quieter. After her sentencing, she was placed under strict supervision, allowed to live, but never free. She moved through her days under constant watch, her name stained, her choices forever chained to betrayal. Michael thought of her sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with the distant ache of someone who had once believed in her smile. She had been part of his story, and now she was part of his past. Life, however, has a way of moving even through the ruins. Teresa Collins, the woman from his youth, had remained by his side. She did not demand that he forget, nor did she pretend the scars weren't there. Instead, she shared his silence, filled his empty rooms with warmth, and reminded him that life could be rebuilt not in grand gestures, but in the small rituals of trust. Together they cooked dinners, shared walks through the quiet city streets, and slowly pieced together a rhythm that felt steady, real. And always, there were the dogs. Ranger grew slower with each passing season. His once strong frame moved with effort, his eyes clouded faintly with age. But his spirit never dimmed. He still sat closest to Michael, still lifted his head at the faintest sound, still watched Teresa with a knowing calm that said, "She belongs here." Shadow remained vigilant, pacing like a restless guardian, while Scout grew into a gentle anchor, always pressing close when Michael's thoughts drifted too far into shadows. Then one morning Michael awoke to a silence he could not mistake. Ranger lay on his blanket by the window, the soft sunlight spilling across his fur. His body was still, his breath absent, his face peaceful in eternal rest. Michael knelt beside him, his hand trembling as he stroked the fur one last time. Tears came quietly, not in a flood, but in a steady stream that blurred his vision. Shadow pressed against his shoulder. Scout whimpered softly, and Teresa knelt with him, her arms wrapping around his back. They buried Ranger beneath the great oak at the edge of the field near Michael's childhood home, the same tree that had stood through every season of his life. The ground was soft, the air heavy with memory. A small stone was placed at the base, carved with simple words that held the weight of everything Ranger had been, more than a dog. He was my truth. As the earth settled, Michael stood back, his hand resting on Shadow's head, Scout leaning into his leg. The wind moved through the oak's branches, whispering like a voice that lingered beyond sight. Ranger was gone, but his spirit was everywhere, in the quiet strength of Shadow, in the steady loyalty of Scout, and in the lessons etched deep into Michael's soul. The days that followed were quieter, but not empty. Michael carried Ranger's memory in every step, every choice. Teresa's presence softened the edges of grief, her voice reminding him that love once broken could still be found again. Shadow and Scout filled the spaces Ranger had left, their loyalty unshaken, their companionship a living thread of continuity. Life was no longer about running from betrayal or surviving shadows. It became about rebuilding one day at a time, guided by the loyalty of those who had never left. Michael found himself smiling again, laughing even as Shadow barked at squirrels in the park, and Scout wagged his tail with gentle persistence whenever he brought home groceries. In the evenings, he sometimes sat beneath the oak, speaking aloud words no one else could hear. He spoke to Ranger, to the loyalty that had saved him time and again, to the truth that had carried him through fire, betrayal, and loss. And in those moments, he felt less alone. Michael Hayes closed that chapter of his life not with bitterness, but with gratitude. He had been betrayed, yes. He had been hunted, yes, but he had also been saved again and again by the unwavering devotion of 3 dogs whose loyalty had never faltered. And so he left behind a message simple yet powerful. For anyone who would listen, sometimes survival and the courage to trust again do not come from human strength alone. Sometimes they begin with the loyalty of 4 legs, a beating heart, and eyes that never look away.